I'm here to talk about the sociology of disenfranchised grief among vegans. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the unceded land on which I'm working today, which is the Bundjalung peoples, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any elders here today. This paper represents a return to the concept of disenfranchised grief, which I first researched as an undergraduate at Monash Uni in the mid-90s, establishing Australia's first animal companion bereavement service as a consequence. And I welcome all feedback and suggestions on these thoughts, which are very much in their early stages. So the disenfranchised grief I've been discussing with others over the past few years more recently is vegan grief. I argue that we might use the enfranchisement of this grief as a means for furthering social change. Firstly, I consider why this grief is disenfranchised and the threat that its acknowledgement represents to powerful ideologies supporting speciesism, which are inherently resistant to the critique that vegan grief represents. At its heart, vegan grief itself is a grief of acknowledgement of the lives of other animals and their erasure, marginalisation or devaluing within current social discourses, particularly capitalist, which has been effectively argued by animal studies scholars and, as you say, was brilliantly put on that structural angle with Nick just now. That's great. In acknowledgement of the likely collective grief of those at this conference, I have omitted distressing images which provoke or intensify vegan grief from my PowerPoint, while fully supporting the demonstrated efficacy of such images in other contexts. However, as a therapist as well as a sociologist, it seems both unnecessary and hypocritical to intensify the very issues I'm concerning myself with. I would also like to note that I have deliberately used the plural term vegan worldviews in my title, recognising that I'm necessarily discussing this issue in reductive ways that conceptualise vegans as a somewhat homogenous group, and that this concept is itself open to question. This is not how I conceptualise veganism. Sociology, after all, demands that we pay attention to the margins in its use of analyses of power inspired by Marxism, and my background's also Marxist and feminist. And as in sociology's considerations of the means to power over large social groups that Foucault describes, for example, that we also choose to pay close attention to language and terminology that seeks to naturalise and reinforce boundaries of practice, norms, and the status quo. Furthermore, postmodern sociological theory demonstrates the fallacy of ideas of innocence or outsider status when we consider social lives and interactions, such as Baudrillard theorises this, and feminists, including sociologists in animal studies, have drawn attention to artificial hierarchies which rely on suppression and erasure of disruptive materialities and affective experiences. Sociological theory then increases the complexity of a term like vegan by situating humans as irrevocably part of systems, social spaces and structures that are premised on and function through assumptions of human superiority and the mistreatment, use and slaughter of other animals. This inevitable collusion that sociology exposes to us is arguably a significant part of the vegan grief that I'm talking about. As Taylor and Sutton have reminded us, the whole sociological canon is also premised on human exceptionalism, so sociology itself is not exempt from this analysis and critique either. This photograph is the inspiration for the original research that I did. This is Ben. So looking at disenfranchised grief, taking the sociological aim of exposing power relations in order to critique, I argue that vegan grief is a potentially radical discourse to make visible human exceptionalism in our societies, despite the entrenched nature based on historic normalisation of speciesism. Grief is traditionally associated with psychology, and we often think of it in those terms, often represented as a very personal and private experience and one that is internal. However, what we label as grief in the first place is socially defined and supported by norms and folkways regarding who or what are deemed worthy of grief, who is allowed to express grief, how they are allowed to express it, and for how long. In fact, the whole concept of grief is governed by social rules and norms, which are implicated as well in grief hierarchies. That was a major finding, which is obviously very relevant to vegan research about pet loss, companion animal loss, that there are hierarchies as well, that cats and dogs might be acceptable to grieve for, but not fish or animals that are free, for example. These also include how our emotional responses are labelled, responded to, and conceptualised by both ourselves and others. Without the powerful social stories of loss and mourning, grief has no traction. The term grief itself, I would argue, is a social term. Grief, then, is socially situated and only effective insofar as individuals are enabled social recognition, mourning, and rituals associated with bereavements and the bereaved. Grief, death, dying and bereavement studies has often been focused on individuals and thus frequently understood and examined purely as a psychological phenomenon. However, the very event of loss and the experience of grief is meaningless, arguably a place of Durkheim's anomie or normlessness, without its positioning in a social setting as a sociological phenomenon. Material objects are socially recognisable and make reference to grief, such as coffins, headstones, death columns, bereavement cards, to name a few common items. The experience is not solely individual, but social. So the experience of grief as socially sanctioned or otherwise is well summarised by this term coined by Ken Doka in 1989, disenfranchised grief. Doka himself used the example of sympathy cards, which are material sociological items, which where he argued that disenfranchised grief was a loss for which one could not purchase a sympathy card, pointing to these objects as social indicators of some of these grief hierarchies and what could and could not be permissibly mourned in our society. So Doka provides 4 examples of how grief is socially disenfranchised, and it is the first of these that I'm giving attention to today. This is a grief that isn't considered worthy of grief, I argue that vegan grief can usefully be situated within this category of disenfranchised grief. Although grief is present every day in the lives of vegans, it cannot be acknowledged or considered part of the social discourses of veganism because it relies on a critique that includes witnessing the scale of animal oppression and the many ways our social structure supports and perpetuates these. And I also note, and it's something I'd like to pursue in a later paper, that we could use the term disenfranchised grief to also conceptualise other species grief because of human imposed fragmentation, separation, and death, including farming practices. So all of the grief of other animals is disenfranchised. So just to think about vegan grief, vegans daily live with disenfranchised grief. Once you know, you can't not know, as one research participant said. Whether we live in cities or rural areas, it becomes necessary to actively suppress much of our consciousness just to operate in the world. We know that animals in paddocks are not the happy farm that we were led to believe as children. We are conscious of suicide advertising. Visiting supermarkets puts us in complex and difficult relationships with systems that we detest. Seeing and smelling animal body parts is an ongoing trauma. Consciousness of number of animals killed every minute, the list goes on. For many of us, there is a constant awareness through a range of everyday situations that other animals are being kept against their will, deprived of any expression of desire, raped in our name, separated from their families, transported in giant trucks, manhandled, mistreated, experimented on, and killed in cruel, painful, and often terrifying ways at mostly very young ages. In the light of this, it's no wonder that McKay, in her recent novel, which I've pictured here, The Animals in That Country, which was released during the first COVID lockdown in Australia, about a fast-spreading flu that enabled humans to hear other animals, chose to represent this experience among thousands of humans as driving them to madness. This vegan grief is something I hear among vegans everywhere, including at conferences such as these, and it's one of the reasons we, like any social group, probably feel a sense of relief in coming together. Oh dear. Next slide. So Foucault's analysis, with its focus on asymmetrical power arrangements and the structured sets of meanings which develop discourses, is useful here. In relation to other animals, we might particularly consider the argument that what constitutes the truth socially is always a consequence of effective expressions of power. While Foucault's ideas around discourses have been expanded to increase their range and complexity, the relationships of power and truth status that he described remain useful tools, particularly for sociologists. Consider discourses around vegans. Overall, they remain negative, as we've been discussing. Vegans are the butt of jokes, they are irate, they are irrational, They show you images you don't want to see, so you don't want to follow them on social media. They have a fundamentalist, unsocial agenda, reminding you of the everyday norms your life relies on and its extreme realities in relation to other animal lives. They are often depicted as uneducated, fringe-dwelling hippies, particularly in my region up here in northern New South Wales, according to conservative political commentary in Australia. The recoil because of the stereotypes in social discourse around the term vegan makes it unmarketable for a capitalist economy. This is indicated in the rise of the term plant-based to label vegan food, suggesting care for the planet or health may be shifting into the mainstream. Although cynically, of course, following Baudrillard, bringing sociology into it, we might see this as an opportunity to commodify token gestures towards care for the planet, for example, but vegans remain marginalised. In this term, it is an emerging artificial dualism of vegan and plant-based. We see it further reinforced in Animals Australia, a peak body labelling their vegan starter pack as vegetarian. That's a comment rather than a critique, and I have discussed that with them. Vegan grief can be considered a radical practice situated socially. Grief has hierarchies and rules, and the term disenfranchised speaks to these. But grief also has social traction, even when it begins in the misunderstood margins. For many, norms around grief remain respectful. Grief needs to be heard. Grief needs to be given space. So the counter-discursive potential that I can see in enfranchising vegan grief suggests possibility for social leverage towards change, particularly as we consider the increasing use and acceptance of the term eco-grief. Acknowledgement of grief, both individually and socially, requires attention. By magnifying the grief of vegans, I suggest we might create space for the development of new social discourses that account for what vegans live with. These stories or discourses query and unsettle the existing order, particularly those discourses that have truth status currently in our society, such as capitalist growth, human exceptionalism, human rights, and the deep historic connections that have placed other animals' lives at the disposal of humans. This slide represents some of the current discourses around activism in Australia, which I now don't have time to discuss. However, in effect, the government created a discourse that activists filming or rescuing on farms were a threat to farmers. There was depressing commentary on this from a vegan point of view, leading up to the passing of what is commonly now known as the Ag-Gag law in Australia last year. This commentary deserves a paper of its own, I realised as I started exploring this. But the commentary was centred in the media on human rights, property ownership, and the physical safety of farmers in contrast to vegans. And it completely elided the issue of grief or acknowledgement of vegan worldviews that I've been discussing today. There's something lovely to look at. That is Orlando. At the outset of this paper, I described some of the ways sociological theory is used to demonstrate our collusion as vegans because we are all born into a pre-existing society, as Durkheim noted. I would like to end with the sociological concept of hope. Sociology, in requiring this deep examination of the complex nature of our individual and collective entanglements with structures of systemic and pervasive abuse of other species by humans, also demands something else. Sociology tells us we must imagine other worlds in which hierarchies are reconfigured and reconsidered. Our gathering together at this conference today represents that we're here to join that challenge toward change, to use and expand sociological ideas in order to expose more of the oppression of other species, imagining alternative worlds. Grief may not at first seem like a place of radicalisation, but I'm arguing it can be. That vegan grief in particular represents a powerful counter-discursive acknowledgement of the systemic erasure and abuse of other animal species, including their own experiences of grief consequent on our imposing of human exceptionalism. If we include the enfranchisement of vegan grief as part of the aims to eradicate griefs that are socially unsanctioned and disenfranchised, we might create spaces for new and alternative social stories that enable a broader understanding of the witnessing and acknowledgements of vegan worldviews. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Josephine. That was an exceedingly conceptually and politically rich paper. Fantastic job there. And so, and thanks again for keeping to time so well.
Did I?
Yeah, you did. Yes, we've got 5 minutes now for, I'm sure there'll be a few questions or comments. So I just open up to our audience to flag up with your hand if you can on the screen so I can see you, or just in the tech chat box if you'd like to raise a question or a comment. Oh, Adam, to you, Josephine, what would it look like to facilitate this type of grief safely?
Oh, do you mean within a vegan context or in the broader social context?
Adam, do you want to just broader social context?
I guess in the broader social context, I don't see safety as so much of an issue. I think in the vegan context, like I speak to vegans at conferences who are absolutely exhausted emotionally, and I know that one of our papers later on addresses the emotional exhaustion that the grief and this kind of work brings for us. So I guess that in the social context, I think it's quite a radical idea to conceptualize grief, and I don't see it as necessarily requiring huge amounts of safety in that more broad social context, because I think it's because of all those reasons we've talked about. Because if we think about enfranchising vegan grief and looking at vegan worldviews, that there's already present a storying of vegans that's very much not associated with any empathy for the vegan worldview. So I guess it begins by engaging with that. Sorry. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, and there's a lovely question from Browne there. Do you think there could be interesting connections between vegan grief and climate grief?
Yes. So that's partly what I was talking to, because I also think this very much relates to the COVID moment and the raising of eco grief, and the raising of issues around people choosing not to have children, all sorts of issues that are being raised by the climate crisis more broadly and eco grief more broadly. And I also know someone at my own institution at Griffith Uni is researching the grief in relation to the loss of wildlife during the fires.
Joy, come out.
Sorry.
That's all right. So I think more broadly it is being seen, but again, I guess what concerns me about that is hierarchies, because I think we keep returning to these hierarchical views, which are very much based in dualism. So I think we've got to be so careful about our language, because Siobhan O'Sullivan wrote a great article during the bushfires talking about the fact that it was considered socially acceptable to grieve for the wildlife that was killed in the bushfires, but it's socially not acceptable to be grieving for the farmed animals that were trapped in paddocks. And as you can imagine, what vegans are feeling around all of that. So I'm really conscious of the ways that this becomes hierarchy, which is why I mentioned that hierarchy, the artificial hierarchy of plant-based and vegan. Yeah.
Yeah, some really interesting discussion happening in the box as well from Nick. Have you considered the role of anger too? I definitely suffer the grief, but I also have a boatload of anger, and that, of course, like grief, is gendered and it's in its acceptance.
Yes. Yeah, so in grief studies, the general understanding of anger would be that anger is masking grief. And I hear what you're saying, Nick, because I think a lot of us feel furious and full of grief at different times. And I think it's not one thing or the other, it's probably both, and and it's a fluctuating thing depending on what we're considering in that particular time. And yes, my PhD is in gender studies. So yes, I do think about those grief issues in relation to how they're gendered as well. So it's kind of those approaches and making it really murky that I'm looking at for this paper, because I really would like to publish this paper, continue to develop the ideas.
All right, look, thank you so much. What another fantastic session. It's been an absolute joy today so far. I'm sure it will continue to be. as we move through. But just want to take this opportunity to thank Zoe, Nick and Josephine for 3 wonderful papers, for opening up more and more critical and really creative discussion. So thank you all very much, and we will be back